Hello, in this video, I want to continue the series that we've been doing with Baudrillard in the context of the space privatization resolution. I definitely think that there are a lot of really interesting ways that postmodernism, specifically Baudrillard's work, really comes into contact with the context of space privatization. I've gone over a lot of the reasons why I think that the ideas of like science and technology, time, and kind of like the future that all really go with the kind of like topics that are around space really are hold hand in hand with some of the arguments that Baudrillard is really making about simulacra and the kind of importance of particular types of like cultural and political imagery. And so I want to kind of continue the conversations that we've been having, and I think in order to do that, you should definitely go and watch at least the intro to Baudrillard and space privatization, because I think that it provides good background for like your ability to kind of like understand like how the particular cultural and symbolic images that are produced in the context of space have like a lot of bearing on the ways in which Baudrillard is kind of like thinking about some of the responses that are created by various types of policies and the types of ways that kind of like we should be responding in the frame of trying to like kind of like hack at or sabotage the ways in which like capitalism and acceleration as kind of like principles have really gotten a hold of like how the private sector is able to view and understand its relationship to space. In this particular video, I want to start talking about how policy teams should respond to Baudrillard, which kind of like goes as a direct response to the videos that I just made when I was talking about how to make Baudrillard as a critical strategy work better against policy teams, and hopefully it'll help you think of like some better responses that you can make to Baudrillard outside of a lot of like the go-to responses that you probably already have, and hopefully it could kind of like help build your repertoire of like what some of the best arguments that you could really be making. I think in the context of just like what we're doing for the priorities against this argument or what you should really be focusing on, I think a lot of the arguments that you really want to make is making like a clear difference between like status quo space policy in the context of privatization and what it would mean to like lock private entities out of space. I think that making a really good argument about how there are comparative differences in like the material realities that are faced, the levels of extraction that are done for resources, and the way that it just relates to capitalism and the acceleration of capitalism as like an economic system should all be arguments that you really want to preface at the top of like a lot of your arguments here, because I feel like a lot of the Baudrillard teams in this context will really try to get away in a lot of debates with just trying to win that a particular kind of like a relationship the particular relationship that will probably develop between a lot of the arguments that they want to make and where you kind of want to situate your stuff is that they kind of want to win, and the way in which you're trying to defy against the current way in which space is being organized is really only a reinstantiation of like what society and like the kind of like way in which we're thinking about structures of power want things to operate, and ultimately kind of like saturate our understanding of space in order to kind of like win over the public. And so I feel like a lot of the arguments that you really want to make are about like why space privatization is something that kind of like already has a hold over like public over imagination, and that's why like part of it is really bad, and why like a lot of the public imagination is thus something that is kind of constructed through the various types of policies that we put in place, through the ways that we kind of decide the development of what type of technology in the context of space and what we want to do with that technology. And I think a lot of the stuff that we really want to like make in order to make that possible requires to really develop for you to develop these types of arguments on various portions of the flow in order to kind of like keep it in the judge's mind, the kind of like differences and comparisons that you want to make, in order for you to make sense of like why winning this argument is kind of a crucial part of your strategy and what it does in order to influence like particular line by line arguments. And I think that being able to like keep that really fresh in the mind of the judge can really help you kind of like push and really frame a lot of the more like generic evidence and other things like that you might have already situated to answer this type of argument. Additionally, I think that a lot of the stuff that I would be focusing on in this context is making sure that you have a clear way of like how you're able to evaluate like what the solvency is and like how you want to do impact comparison. I think that a place that like a lot of Baudrillard teams really missed the boat on is how to get to like a really good level of comparative impact ideas when they're kind of like outside of the confines of just winning this kind of like unique, overwhelming amount of uniqueness and top level arguments. And so I think really kind of like pushing arguments about like kind of the material necessity the idea of being able to think through and make decisions about some of the like the material confines of the AF is like super important, and things that have like effects on like real people's lives and things that you should really be emphasizing when you get to that portion of the debate. But I think for where I kind of want to go next in this video to kind of start off to figure out how we get there is to really focus in on like part of the framing portion of the debate. I think that framing the debate is super important because I feel like a lot of the teams, a lot of the Baudrillard teams really stock a lot of their game and like how the judge is kind of like framing and evaluating the value, the idea of like why debate is valuable and like what kind of like dialogue and things like that produce. this is also where I feel like a lot of teams are really going to start putting in a lot of their offense in terms of like why things like policy skills and just the idea of being able to think through and produce like a fiat interpretation, a fiat relationship to the resolution as like particularly violent. And I think that you need to kind of like make a bunch of arguments here that I don't often see a lot of LD teams make, which is really starting to push the idea of like why particular skills that we get out of what we do in debate is particularly good. I think that regardless of whether or not you want to go for like a game-based framing for what you want your framework to do, you still need arguments as to why those things are generative in the concepts of like what types of skills and other things that they teach us. Because then I feel like if you don't really have those things, you lack a lot of depth and texture to your arguments. That means that the kind of like utility-based and like much more like a pedagogically based arguments that negative teams can make in the context of this means that they have like a lot of offense for you to weigh. And I feel like you're kind of like stuck in this place where there are two ships passing in the night, when instead I feel like you could be pushing a lot of arguments about like why the way that we kind of consider the role of space and things like that in the context of policy have really like strong like bearing impacts in the way that we kind of like think about ourselves and like orient these things like politically and makes decisions outside of the context of just debate. And then I think as you transfer to your thesis arguments, a lot of the arguments that you want to make is not that science fiction imaginary and the types of like hyper capital kind of imagery that is produced in the world is what makes policy, but rather policy is kind of what controls the limits and confines of like what allows those things to be possible. Obviously policy can't like, for instance, censor like the science fiction as like a particular idea or like, you know, genre of books. But for instance, the kind of idea of, for instance, refusing things like a privatized relationship to space or a privatized kind of like advancement of space means that there are a lot of ways in which you can kind of refuse the idea that space should be an individualized kind of like hyper-capitalist plane where only one person should take measure. And that already does something to kind of like hack at the way in which capitalism is able to like seed into or be able to become like part of the framing for how we're thinking about like what policies get made. And I think that making arguments about like why the way in which the particular policies that you're making that start with the kind of like refusal of like a kind of like privatized usage of space like allows for this kind of like usage of public space that is good and it goes a different direction than something that's focused on only certain individuals being able to access and gain like value out of space. And then I feel like you need to make arguments about like why the idea of just like giving a space or seeding space only allows for things like the worst impacts to happen, makes it more probable that we're not able to, for instance, save some of the resources that are on Earth through like different uses of things like, for instance, satellite, solar energy, etc. And also why those things also increase the kind of like likelihood of being hit by things like different asteroids, collision from technology that's already in space, etc. And things that already kind of like exist, that factors that kind of move us closer towards extinction and having to think through death and like maybe some of the factors that what the alternative is considering. And I think in that context you can start putting some of the pressure on them to be able to resolve these concerns, or maybe you can get an advantageous position on some of these other portions of the flow that we'll be talking about in the next video. And so hopefully you tune in for that. And yeah, thank you as always for tuning in.